Chicago, 1954. A young mother walks out of a hospital with empty arms, still weeping for the child she just lost. The doctor told her the autopsy was a formality, a routine step in the grieving process. He didn't mention that her daughter's bones were already being packed into a lead-lined crate, destined for a secret laboratory thousands of miles away. This was not a search for a cure, and it wasn't a standard medical procedure. Her child had just become a serial number in a global operation known as Project Sunshine. The goal was simple, clinical, and devastating: to see how much of the nuclear age was already hiding inside the human skeleton. The early 1950s were defined by a peculiar kind of terror. The world had witnessed the blinding flash of the atom, but the invisible consequences were still a terrifying mystery. As the United States and its allies accelerated their nuclear testing programs in the desert and across the Pacific, a new ghost began to haunt the atmosphere. Its name was Strontium-90. This radioactive isotope did not exist in nature before the dawn of the nuclear age. It was a product of the fallout, drifting on the wind, settling into the soil, the water, and eventually the food chain. Scientists quickly realized that Strontium-90 behaved remarkably like calcium. To the human body, the two were nearly indistinguishable. If it entered the system through milk or grain, the body would mistakenly use it to build teeth and bone, locking a source of internal radiation into the skeleton for a lifetime. The Atomic Energy Commission faced a desperate, silent question: how much of this poison was already inside us? To find the answer, they needed human tissue. But they didn't just need any tissue, they needed the skeletons of those who had the least amount of time to accumulate natural minerals, those whose bodies were built entirely from the environment of the nuclear age. They needed the bones of the very young. This realization birthed a covert operation that would span continents and decades, driven by a cold mathematical necessity that seemed to ignore the traditional sanctity of the family unit. In the laboratories of the Rand Corporation and various high-level universities, the secret memos began to circulate. The project required a massive influx of samples to create a statistically significant map of the world's radiation. However, the scientists faced an immediate human hurdle. Most people are not willing to surrender the remains of their loved ones to a government program, especially for something as frightening as radiation testing. The solution was as simple as it was chilling. They decided not to ask. A network was established, connecting government officials with doctors and pathologists in hospitals across the United States, the United Kingdom, and as far away as Australia. The instructions were clear but kept strictly away from public view. When a young life ended prematurely, samples were to be taken during the autopsy. In many cases, these were not just small fragments. Entire limbs or sections of the spine were removed. The parents were often told that the body was being handled according to standard medical protocols, or that certain parts were needed for research into the cause of death. The word nuclear was never mentioned. The word fallout was kept behind locked doors. To the grieving parents, it was a medical necessity. To the state, it was the harvesting of biological data. One mother in Chicago would only discover the truth decades later. At the time, she believed her daughter had been laid to rest in peace. She didn't know that while she was mourning at an empty grave or a sealed casket, her child's remains were being flown across the ocean to be burned in a high-security furnace. When the records were finally declassified in the mid-1990s, she realized her child had been a data point on a ledger, a clean sample. Because adults had spent years building their bones before the first bombs fell, their skeletons were considered contaminated by the past. The infants were the only true sensors for the present. The logistics of Project Sunshine were handled with the precision of a military campaign. In the United Kingdom, similar operations were taking place under a veil of professional silence. Records suggest that over 3,000 samples were collected in secret. The donors were often from families who lacked the resources or the social standing to question the authority of the medical establishment. There was a prevailing sense of paternalism in the mid-century medical field. Doctors were seen as figures of absolute trust, and their requests were rarely scrutinized. This trust became the shadow behind which the secret collection flourished. At the heart of the American effort was Willard Libby, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. His drive for data was relentless, fueled by the pressures of the Cold War. In transcripts from secret meetings that surfaced years later, his frustration with the slow pace of sample collection was evident. He spoke of the difficulty in obtaining human samples and famously remarked to his colleagues that if anyone knew of a way to acquire them, even through unconventional means, the project would be greatly indebted to them. He emphasized that the samples needed to be fresh, a clinical term that masked the tragedy of the source. When the samples arrived at the laboratories, they were processed in a way that stripped them of any human identity. They were reduced to ash in high-temperature ovens, a process designed to isolate the minerals for analysis. The resulting white powder was then tested for its radioactive signature. The data flowed into charts and graphs that predicted the long-term impact of nuclear testing on the global population. The scientists were looking for the threshold, the point at which the fallout in the atmosphere would lead to a spike in bone-related illnesses across the world. In a dark irony, they were using the dead to predict the fate of the living. As the 1950s turned into the 60s, the scale of the testing grew. The Pacific Proving Grounds and the Nevada test site were sending plumes of debris into the stratosphere with every new detonation. Every time a new weapon was tested, the urgency of Project Sunshine increased. The project expanded its reach, looking for samples in areas where the fallout was expected to be highest due to weather patterns. They were mapping the invisible footprint of the Cold War, and that map was being built from the very fabric of a generation. The secrecy held for decades. It was a silence maintained by a shared understanding among the scientific and political elite that the survival of the nation depended on this knowledge. They believed that the threat of nuclear war was so great that the individual rights of a few thousand grieving families were a necessary price to pay. It was the ultimate expression of a greater good philosophy, pushed to a cold and logical extreme. The ends, they argued, justified the means, even if those means involved the unauthorized use of those who had no voice to begin with. The cracks in the story didn't start to appear until the late 20th century. Investigative journalists and concerned researchers began to piece together a fragmented paper trail. They found inconsistencies in hospital records and strange gaps in the documentation of deceased infants. The whispers of a bone trade began to circulate in academic circles. In 1995, the veil was finally torn away. The United States government commissioned a report on human radiation experiments, and the true scope of Project Sunshine was brought into the light. The public was suddenly confronted with the reality that their government had participated in a global network of body snatching. The revelation was met with a mixture of horror and profound sadness. For the families involved, it was a secondary trauma that reopened old wounds. They had spent a lifetime believing their children had been laid to rest, only to find out that parts of them had been used as tools for the state. The apology issued by the government was formal and sincere, but for many, it felt insufficient. It raised questions that had no easy answers. How do you compensate for a violation that occurred in the most vulnerable moment of a person's life? How do you return what has already been turned to ash in a laboratory furnace? The ethical fallout of Project Sunshine continues to be debated. It serves as a haunting cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked scientific pursuit and the ease with which human rights can be set aside in the name of national security. It forces us to ask, who owns our bodies after we are gone? And what limits should be placed on the state's power to use its citizens as biological sensors? The project did yield data that helped scientists understand how strontium-90 moves through the environment. This information eventually contributed to the push for the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which moved nuclear testing underground and significantly reduced the amount of radioactive material entering the atmosphere. There is a bitter irony in the fact that a project conducted with such ethical disregard helped lead to a safer world for the survivors. The knowledge was gained, but the cost was a fundamental breach of the social contract. Today, the files on Project Sunshine are mostly open. We can read the memos, see the charts, and track the locations of the samples. But the clinical language of the reports still fails to capture the human reality of the operation. It doesn't describe the quiet corridors of the hospitals or the whispered conversations between doctors who knew they were taking something that didn't belong to them. It doesn't account for the decades of silence kept by those who managed the logistics of the harvest. The story of Project Sunshine remains a chilling reminder that the darkest parts of history aren't always found on the battlefield. Sometimes they are found in the sterile environment of a laboratory, where the pursuit of an answer becomes more important than the dignity of the individual. It is a story of a time when the world was so afraid of the future that it was willing to sacrifice the sanctity of its past. As we look back at this mystery, it remains a shadow that haunts the edges of the Cold War narrative. How many other programs were operating under similar veils of secrecy? How much of our modern understanding of safety was built on foundations of unauthorized research? The bones of the children of the 1950s have long since completed their journey through the labs, but the questions they leave behind are still vibrating in the air. The legacy of the project is not just in the data points or the treaties, but in a lingering distrust of authority that persists in the collective memory. It is a reminder that transparency is often the only safeguard against the cold logic of the greater good. When the state begins to view its citizens as mere biological resources, the line between protection and exploitation begins to disappear. The sun may have set on Project Sunshine, but the shadows it cast remain long and deep. It stands as a silent testimony to a generation that was used without its knowledge to measure the heat of an atomic world. In the end, the project is a paradox. It was a search for light and safety in an era of darkness and fear, yet it employed methods that were as dark as the threats it sought to understand. It remains a somber chapter in the history of science, a mystery that was solved only to reveal a truth that many wish had never been possible. It is a monument to the complexity of human progress, where every step forward is sometimes shadowed by a step away from our own humanity. The remains are gone, the labs are closed, but the echoes of that silent harvest still linger in the archives of a world that was learning, for the first time, what it meant to live in the shadow of the atom.